Without further ado, Dr. Chesler.
I am so pleased to be at the Strand. I began coming here in 1957 when I worked for D. Brown Plumbing, a little bit down the block when I was 17, and I've spent many, many happy hours here. So I'm thrilled to be here. It is a long-standing, independent, not chained bookstore with magnificent finds. So thank you for having me. This book is dedicated to our unknown soldiers whose mighty deeds were either disappeared or never documented. Those who saved women's lives while risking their own, and those who served the cause of women's freedom with humility and dedication, and in so doing, braved scorn daily. This book is dedicated to our women of ideas, our wordsmiths, our artistes of activism, and to every feminist of my generation who fought for women's rights. This book is also dedicated to the men who helped us. The author is especially grateful to those who were kind to strong and fiery women. This is from the introduction. I've written many books, but never before have I written a book in this way. The chapters tumbled out all at once. I could barely keep up with them. Stories that belonged at the end of the book demanded my attention, even as I was writing about something that took place much earlier. This book happened just like Second Wave Feminism did, all at once. The world had never seen anything like us, and we'd never seen anything like each other. We who only yesterday had been viewed as cunts, whores, dykes, bitches, witches, and madwomen, we who had been second and third-class citizens had suddenly become players in history. The world would never be the same, and neither would we. I was born on October 1st, 1940, in Borough Park, Brooklyn, exactly 10 months after my parents were married. Like all firstborn Orthodox Jewish girls, I was supposed to be a boy. In many ways, I behaved like a boy. I refused to help my mother wash the dishes. I played punchball and stickball, and soon enough engaged in other kinds of games with boys. Although I was known as a brain, I was also an early blooming outlaw. I ran away from home when I was 5 years old and got a job sweeping the floor in the barbershop across the street. The police found me and brought me home. Only boys, especially boys who wrote, did things like that. They hit the road, walked across America, drank, took drugs, had sex, lots of sex, led expatriate lives, joined the Navy. Nice Jewish girls, nice American girls, were not supposed to do such things, but some of us did. I'm a quintessential American, the daughter and granddaughter of immigrants. I'm a Jewish American, heir to a treasured tradition of learning that has survived countless massacres, exiles, and genocides. I'm a child of the working poor, a daughter of earth. America and the moment in history at which I was born meant that I received a first-class education. On my father's side, I'm a first-generation American. I know that my father, Leon, was born in 1912 in Ukraine. He was a child survivor of World War I, the Russian Revolution, a civil war, and pogroms. He never once mentioned any of this. Nothing this important was ever openly discussed. How can I ever piece together his story? My father named me after the mother he barely knew. My Yiddish name is Pearl, a woman hacked to death by Cossacks in the tea shop when my father was only an infant. My mother was the only member of her family who was born in America. Her parents and sisters were born in Poland. My grandparents never learned to speak English. My mother remained their translator and only caregiver until they died. I wrote the first draft of this book as if it were a mural. Every day you could find me perched on my stool as I checked memory against diaries, correspondence, scrapbooks. I could spend weeks reworking a small detail in one corner of the canvas. I was everywhere at the same time, all over my feminist life, writing about patriarchy in Kabul in 1961, attending a National Organization for Women meeting in 1967, co-founding the Association for Women in Psychology in 1969, demanding $1 million in reparations for women from the American Psychological Association, too little money, and pioneering one of the first women's studies courses in 1970, delivering a keynote speech at the first radical feminist conference on rape in 1971, publishing Women in Madness in 1972. We pioneers emerged between 1963 and 1973 and took ideas seriously. Some of us were geniuses. Most of us were dangerously intelligent, and most of us were radical thinkers. We did not all think alike. We were champion hair splitters and disagreed with each other with searing passion. In our midst was the usual assortment of scoundrels, sadists, bullies, con artists, liars, loners, and incompetents, not to mention the high-functioning psychopaths, schizophrenics, manic depressives, and suicide artists. I loved them all. I even began to love myself. Without a feminist movement, I would have had a career, but not necessarily a calling. I still would have written my books, but they would have had much smaller audiences and far less impact. We knew nothing, absolutely nothing, about our American and European feminist foremothers, even less about non-Western women, including feminists. In Women of Ideas and What Men Have Done to Them, 1982, the divine Australian scholar Dale Spender documented how the most remarkable feminist work had been systematically disappeared again and again. Few of us knew that feminists before us had battled for women's rights in the Western world in the 18th, 19th, and 20th centuries. Feminists had opposed sex slavery, wage slavery, marriage, organized religion, and the absence of women's legal, economic, educational, and political rights. Their writings were brilliant and fiery, but unknown to each successive generation. Each generation of feminists had to reinvent the wheel. Within 10 to 15 years, books by the best mind of my feminist generation were out of print. Within 15 to 20 years, university professors and their students were largely unfamiliar with most of our work. They took for granted or regarded as hopelessly old-fashioned the grueling lawsuits we had brought and our brave activism, if indeed they remembered what we had done at all. In our own lifetimes, we became our suffragist grandmothers and shared their dusty, forgotten fate. But I remember us as we were and how we will always be, politically and sexually daring, vivid, vivacious, incredibly vibrant. Some feminists whose ideas inspired me the most may be unknown to you. This is precisely Dale Spender's point. I hope that what I've written here will draw you closer to their work, that you'll seek it out and come to know it. I've been close to most of our feminist visionaries and icons. What I've written may make you laugh, but it may also shock you. Our feminist pioneers were only mortal. They were as flawed as anyone else, save in their work, which was both extraordinary and overinflated. First, we formed a civil rights organization for women, the National Organization for Women, which brought class action lawsuits and demonstrated against women's legal, reproductive, political, and economic inequality. For the second time in the 20th century, women and some men crusaded for women's rights, this time by focusing on hundreds of issues, not only on one issue, the votes. Then we picketed, marched, protested, sat in, and famously took over offices and buildings, helped women obtain illegal abortions, joined consciousness-raising groups, learned about orgasms, condemned incest, rape, sexual harassment, and domestic violence, organized speak-outs, crisis hotlines, and shelters for battered women, and came out as lesbians. Finally, we implemented feminist ideas within our professions, and so began a process of transformation that continues to this day. These were the three mighty tributaries of the second wave. I swam in all three. Soon, large numbers of women began to integrate previously all-male bastions of power. We became artists, astronauts, business executives, CEOs, clergy, college professors, composers, construction workers, electricians, firefighters, journalists, judges, lawyers, mid-level managers, physicians, pilots, police officers, politicians, professors, scientists, small business owners, and soldiers. Different world now. Not far enough ahead, but a different world. Radical feminist ideas and activism were a bit like LSD. So many women became high at the same time that suddenly the world became psychedelically clear, and all the lost girls found ourselves and each other. This was the first time in my life that I experienced female solidarity based on ideas, and it was wondrous. And yet, I had such an idealized view of feminism and feminists that when I began to encounter incomprehensibly vicious behavior among feminist leaders, I was stunned, blindsided. I had expected so much of other feminists, far too much, perhaps we all did, that when we failed to meet our own high standards, many of us felt betrayed. And then, when we were really betrayed, slandered, shunned by everyone we knew, our ideas stolen, our authority denied, our authorship denied, our history revised, we had no name for what was happening. Eventually, we called some of this trashing, and it drove away many a good feminist. It never stopped me, but it took its toll. This means that my greatest comfort and strength came from doing the work itself, and from knowing that the work touched, changed, and even saved women's lives. This memoir isn't a history of second wave feminism. It's not even a history of my most important feminist ideas and campaigns. This is the story of how a daughter of working poor immigrants came into her own and helped illuminate the path for others. Here I relate some memories from the war zone, stories that are important to me and that might be of interest to you. This book isn't about the generations of feminists who've succeeded us. Their stories belong to them. I was utterly naive and ill-prepared for the life I was destined to lead. Angels must have watched over me. I can offer no better explanation for why I survived and flourished. For more than a half-century, I've been a soldier at war. I carry scars. All warriors do. Most of us were failed daily, both by our opponents and by friendly fire. Despite everything, despite anything, I wouldn't have missed this revolution, not for love or money. I remain forever loyal to that moment in time, that collective awakening that set me free from my former life as a girl. Allow me to paraphrase the most memorable speech Shakespeare gave King Henry V. She that outlives this day and comes safe home, then will she strip her sleeve and show her scars and say, these wounds I had. This story shall the good woman teach her children from this day to the ending of the world, but we in it shall be remembered. We few, we happy few, we band of sisters, for she today that sheds her blood with me shall be my sister, be she ne'er so vile. This day shall gentle her condition, and gentle women everywhere now abed shall think themselves accursed. They were not there, they were not here, and hold their humanity cheap while any speaks that fought with us. I'm skipping the chapter growing up as a girl in America. That was unbelievable. 1940s, 1950s, 1960s, unbelievable. And I'm going directly to the beginning of the action. Am I dreaming or am I awake? Feminist Paradise Rising. It's impossible to convey how excited I was, how excited we all were. While at work at the Brain Research Lab, I somehow heard about a women's meeting. I rushed out, still wearing my white lab coat. I was on the streets searching for the women as if a group of aliens had suddenly landed on Earth. We were all lost in a dream, but we had never been so awake. Women who were once invisible to each other were now the only visible creatures. Women who used to see one another as wicked stepsisters had magically transformed into fairy godmothers. Some of us smoked and drank, wore motorcycle boots, tough leather jackets, and no makeup. We were rather butch, whether we were straight or not. Suddenly, we were the ones who made things happen, not those to whom things happened. Some of us wore feathers, jewelry, and suede vests, bell-bottoms, and lots of makeup. We looked like gypsies or glamorous pirates, and we too made stuff happen. You didn't mess with us anymore. I was as foolish as only a young dreamer could be. But I was no longer alone. Now there was a we, and we wanted to end the subjugation of women. Now, we who had put up with it from the moment we were born wanted it to end immediately, or definitely within the decade. I kid you not, within the decade. None of us understood that this work would occupy us for the rest of our lives, and that all we would be able to claim was the struggle, not the victory. Looking over my early feminist correspondence reminded me of how much affection we had for each other. We, to whom men had not listened, now found that our ideas mattered a great deal to ourselves, to each other, to countless other women. Oh, the number of feminists who signed their letters to me with love, as did I. We hugged and kissed each other as if we were relatives or longtime friends, but we were really strangers, bound only by the moment and our shared vision. I am writing about heroic, historical figures. What defines them is the work they did, not their fearful mortal failings. Most women have internalized sexist values, but they don't lead movements that change the world. However, from a psychological point of view, women, and feminists are mainly women, maybe not so much anymore, but back in the beginning, are as great a challenge to our liberation as men are. For example, we proclaim that sisterhood is powerful. It's such a lovely idea. But such a sisterhood did not normally exist. It had to be created day by day. Women did not always treat each other kindly. Somehow we expected feminists to behave in radically different ways. We were shocked as we learned, one by one, that feminists didn't always treat each other with respect or compassion. I know this now. I did not know it in 1967. We said that women were more compassionate and less aggressive than men, but this isn't true. Seemingly contradictory things can be true psychologically. Women mainly compete against and envy and sabotage other women, and women mainly rely upon other women for intimate relationships. That's how it is. I'm skipping, and now I'm gonna. Valerie Solanas' self-published 1967 Scum Manifesto. Who's read that? Ah, my people are here. Is an angry, frightening, kick-ass feminist work. It's daring and brilliant, a clarion call to arms, perhaps satiric, probably literal. She urges women to overthrow the government, eliminate the money system, and eliminate the male sex. Her manifesto is crazy. Solanas was a physically abused child and incest victim who became homeless at 15. She was a lesbian, a panhandler, and a prostitute. Solanas gave birth to a child when she was 17. The child was taken from her. Solanas' life history resembles that of Eileen Wuornos, the woman who became known as the first female serial killer and the hitchhiking prostitute. Both Solanas and Wuornos, in whose case I eventually became involved, I know how to look for trouble big time, became cult figures a la Jesse James. They were outlaws, but they were female outlaws, far beyond the cinematic Thelma and Louise. They attracted many straight and lesbian feminist supporters whose creative works, films, plays, books, songs, and opera portrayed them. Solanas' book was translated into more than a dozen languages. Academics wrote about both of them. On June 3rd, 1968, as we all know, Valerie shot Andy Warhol. This was the act of a mentally ill woman. Flo Kennedy and T. Grace Atkinson embraced Solanas as a symbol of feminist militancy and rushed to her side. Makes sense. We needed outlaws. They claimed Solanas as one of ours. They visited her in jail. Both Flo and T. Grace were identified with Now. Their attempt to present a mentally ill criminal as a feminist hero made Betty Friedan crazy. Betty viewed Solanas as a man-hating lunatic, not as a feminist hero. Betty feared that Now would be seen as supporting the murder of men. Yes, Solanas' act could be interpreted in feminist terms, and as such exploited by feminists. But Solanas herself was not a feminist. She had acted irrationally, without a goal. She represented no one but herself. Solanas hotly denied any association with feminism, which she described as a civil disobedience luncheon club. Touché, Valerie, touché. Solanas accused T. Grace and Flo of using her to gain fame. Predictably, many years later, Wuornos accused me and all those who tried to help her of the same thing. T. Grace resigned from Now, and Flo quit in solidarity with her. Eventually, Valerie died of pneumonia in 1988 in a San Francisco single-occupancy hotel in the Tenderloin district after spending 3 years hospitalized in an asylum for the criminally insane. Initially, I supported Solanas, just as I supported the issues of self-defense raised by the Eileen Wuornos case. However, once Solanas turned on T. Grace and Flo, I respected Betty's point of view a bit more. Betty Friedan wanted women with status and power, preferably married to upstanding and powerful men, to represent the feminist movement. She wanted no wild-eyed riffraff, no one unpredictable or too radical to become associated in the public eye with what she viewed as her respectable and rational movement. Do you want me to read anything more? Yes. All right. Well, let me see. I have to think. I didn't choose anything else. It's all so good. It's so good. I mean, no, not the book. No, I'm not praising my work. The events, the subject, the women. It is so good. I miss it. It's gone. It has not returned as yet. Well, you know, let me go get myself in a little trouble. The last chapter is titled The End of an Era and Saying Goodbye to Sister Soldiers, Brave and True, Near and Dear. After 9/11, I felt as if the Afghanistan I'd fled so long ago had followed me right into the future and into the West. That distant, dangerous country began to dominate American headlines. Muslim women started wearing burqas, head, face, and body coverings, and niqab, face masks, on the streets of New York City. As global violence against women gained horrendous momentum, many Western feminists became increasingly afraid to criticize the violence, lest they be condemned as colonialists and racists. This fear often trumped their concern for women's human rights globally. This was not the universalist feminism I helped pioneer. We favored multicultural diversity. We were not multicultural relativists. Is this a men's rights movement action? It must be. All right. What can we do? We have to carry on.
It's just New York City.
Just New York. Well, it's the same. This was not the universalist feminism I helped pioneer. We favored multicultural diversity. We were not multicultural relativists. We called out misogyny when we saw it and didn't exempt a rapist, a wife beater, or a pedophile because he was poor. His victims were also poor. Or a man of color. His victims were often also people of color. We had little sympathy for a perpetrator because he had suffered an abused childhood. So had his victim. Fighting for abortion and gay marriage rights in America is a legitimate undertaking, but so is standing with Muslim, ex-Muslim, Hindu, and Sikh dissidents, gays, and members of religiously persecuted minorities, all of whom are fighting for their lives. World events have made feminist ideas far more important, yet at the same time, so many Western feminism has lost some of its power. It's now a diversionary feminism that is also far more invested in blaming the West for the world's misery than in defending Western values, which have inspired countless liberation movements, including our own feminist revolution. Celebrity endorsements or feminism, or celebrity endorsements, or media-inspired celebrity moments are not necessarily movements. If Helen Mirren, whom I love, wears a sparkly skirt in which the word feminist is embroidered again and again, I may like it, but I do not think it equivalent to the Emancipation Proclamation. There are those who do. The balkanization of identity that passes for feminism in the 21st century saddens me. Such balkanization makes it almost impossible to unite in coalition to fight for issues that may not personally affect all the protesters. Many feminist academics and journalists now believe that speaking out against headscarves, hijab, face veils, niqab, the burqa, forced marriage, female genital mutilation, and polygamy is somehow racist. Postmodern ways of thinking have also led feminists to believe that confronting narratives on the academic page or signing petitions are as important and world-shattering as rescuing living beings from captivity. I did not foresee the extent to which feminists, who philosophically are universalists, would paradoxically become isolationists. Such timidity, presumably in the service of opposing racism, is perhaps the greatest failing of the feminist establishment. I recant none of the visionary ideals of second wave feminism. Rather, as a feminist, not as an anti-feminist, I feel obliged to say that something has gone terribly wrong among our thinking classes. The multicultural canon has not led to independent, tolerant, diverse, or objective ways of thinking. On the contrary, it has led to conformity and totalitarian herd thinking. I go on a little bit, go on a little bit more. I'm here, I say. By now, may this memoir stand against the rank and swelling tide of revisionist feminist history. By now, at least 100 active pioneer feminists I knew, or with whom I worked, or whose work brightened my days have died, and with them, an entire universe is gone. I'm here, but without so many I've cherished. Most women cannot survive without their female friends. We tend to have a handful of best friends, not just one. I could not have stayed the warrior's course without such intimates. Here are some of the souls with whom I served. We were soldiers, brave and true. We were friends, near and dear. And I write about Dr. Ruby Rawlick, anthropologist, Andrea Dworkin, Buffy Johnson, artist and author, Arlene Raven, our best feminist art critic, Barbara Seaman, my beloved friend, who pulled me into the founding of the National, I can't remember the names of everything anymore, the National Women's Health Network, which is up and running still, Jill Johnston, Judy O'Neill, Rivka Hout, and Kate Millett. And I'm thinking I could read you one, but it has to be the shortest one, no? Not the longest one. Give me a show of hands. Shortest one, longest one. Longest one. You are very dear. You are dear people. Do Kate. Okay. Yeah, this is long. Okay, so Kate Millett, 1934, 2017. Kate, you took your last breath on earth in the city you loved most, Paris. The city that once welcomed the expatriates, Gertrude, Alice, Pablo, Ernest, and Sir James of Dublin, and where the early morning aroma of fresh bread was reason enough for you to rise too. I finally understood you in historical context when I read Andrea Weiss's Paris Was a Woman, Portraits from the Left Bank. Then I recognized your culture, one in which sophisticated and talented lesbians took many lovers, competed with each other for sexual favors, slept with their lovers' lovers, and everyone either became lifelong friends or abandoned each other or the group entirely. You were just another Irish rebel living in exile. Wherever you lived, you were in exile. When you were in Paris, you were not at home on the Bowery. And when you were in New York, you missed the farm. Just as you belonged to many cities, you also had many different selves. You were many different Kates. You were Kate, the highly ceremonial hostess, offering your guests wine as if it were a libation to the gods, floating little candlelit paper boats out on the lake at the farm for the Japanese holiday of Obon every August. You were also Kate the raging mad queen, Kate the unbearably humble, Kate the increasingly all too silent. You were the most cosmopolitan, the most continental, the most European identified of our feminist intellectuals. Well, Andrea Dworkin was too. You believed that ideas matter and that intellectuals must lay their bodies down for the sake of revolution. Remember that idea? 1968 Redux. You were always broad-minded in both senses of the word. You would not have disapproved of my exposing you here, given how routinely you exposed yourself and everyone else in book after book, and you did so in such a fine stream of consciousness prose, one that was underestimated by critics, but never by me. I admired it. No, I adored it. I was going to read you the passages about you, but then you went ahead and died. You'd been drifting for some time now, whether you were in another country, upstate at the farm, marooned in a hospital, or sitting right across the table from me. You were really, before you were really gone for good, you were no longer exactly here. For years now, when we would meet at the Bowery Bar, right across the street from your loft, you were already far too quiet. Sophie Keir, Susan Bender, sometimes Merle Hoffman, had to join me in keeping the patter going. But you still had your wonderful laugh and your wise and twinkling eyes, which signaled that you understood everything. From time to time, you'd call and leave the most heartbreaking message. Hi, this is your old friend Kate Millett, remember me? And I'd call you right back. Sometimes we were able to have a real, if only a brief conversation, but only as long as I carried the weight for both of us. You no longer raged, at least not at me, not on our precious phone calls, never again in person either. On one of your visits, perhaps a few years ago, you told me you were working on a book about your relationship to de Beauvoir, to the woman and her work, perhaps a book that might encompass your relationship to the entire French literary enterprise. Somebody has to explain it to me. I understood that you were no longer capable of undertaking a big new book, but I quietly volunteered to listen to you talk about this, tape your every word, and help you edit this if you wished. You said yes, but we never spoke about it again. Eventually, I heard that you were working on introducing something that you'd written long ago, perhaps your Tokyo diary, maybe something else altogether. Although you attended marches, protests, press conferences, and sit-ins, you mainly read, wrote books, sculpted, painted, and tried to create a utopian community for lesbian artists. You were also the Kate who could easily pass for a homeless person, out on the Bowery trying to sell your farm-grown Christmas trees in blustery winter weather. Oh, how chapped your hands were, how red were your cheeks. You were Kate the sharecropper, who, like Gerald and Scarlett O'Hara, was adamant that owning land is everything and that land must be kept in the family at all costs. You drove a tractor, cut wood, stood on dangerously high ladders to get at a falling roof, tried to get me to join her, no way. Do you remember the time I visited one weekend when I was on a hard and fast deadline, and you demanded that I just put my shoulder to the wheel of your sheltered workshop and help you repair the roof? I sometimes viewed the farm in just this way, as your personal alternative to a loony bin. Come on, Chesler, you growled. Just get on the goddamn ladder and help me do this. I was horrified, terrified, flabbergasted. But you would not let go of me until I at least planted a victory garden of flowers by your side. But even as Kate the farmer, you still sometimes drank your morning coffee from a French ceramic bowl, always made little toasts at dinner, and were at all times surrounded by books and bookshelves. Skipping a little bit. Does anyone know the book, The Basement, Meditations on a Human Sacrifice? It's a great book. It died an unnatural death, and Kate then did an art installation based on the child, the teenager, Sylvia Likens, who was tortured for weeks in a basement in the Midwest of America. I remember how shocked I was by your art installation on this subject. I did a double take when I realized that the Sylvia mannequin on the floor was dressed in your clothing and had a wig on that was styled exactly the way in which your hair was styled. In going to Iran, you truly grasped the misogynistic nature of an Islamic theocratic regime that would go on to murder its best and its brightest. Khomeini arrested her, but let her go. Do you remember our Christmas Eve parties and the presents we all exchanged, and the New Year's Eve parties too? I often had to initiate the process. Each time you went along with it and were always eventually very pleased, but always, always a bit like Shuli, Firestone. You also stood a bit apart, watching it all, too silent even among your cherished intimates. You were also Kate, the straight, a married lady who genuinely loved your husband, Fumio. Do you remember how you wept when he finally left? You called and between tears said that he'd left you for another woman. I was amazed, but I dared not laugh. Your grief was so raw. Finally, I asked you, but Kate, really, how many women have you left Fumio for? I could not reason with you. Your sorrow and shame were genuine. Katie, I want to thank you for your generosity, for always trying to include me, and for suggesting that others do so too. You introduced me to extraordinary women. As you know, some of these women became very dear to me. It was a privilege to be your friend. I will never forget you. Thank you. I've got to have your picture. Now, I must say, we discussed whether to allow people to just speak spontaneously. But these are very different times. It is very hard to ensure civility in the public space. The divide between opposing points of view is fierce, barbaric, tribal. In America, I'm talking about people with ideas in America. And often when people ask questions, they don't ask questions, they ramble on with points of view that are off topic or very insulting or incomprehensible also. So do we have a lot of index? I mean, so forgive me, I would love a genuine back and forth, but I have been strongly advised against it for safety's sake, for sanity's sake. Do you have any more cards? No more cards? All right. Oh, well, all right, so we have some. Oh, this I can't answer. I'll read what it is. What are your thoughts about the Me Too movement as a platform for future feminist action? So far, it's a digital revolution. It is not yet feet on the ground moving. It is not yet lawsuits that are being brought on behalf of women who work in lettuce fields, women who work in factories whose bosses are protected by unions as they are not, and who will simply fire them or threaten to kill their children. So far at Me Too, as a moment, we are focused on high-profile guys who are not, they don't have contracts with unions. They can be hired at will and fired at will. But it does seem so unseemly to have a killer bee swarm on the internet and then the guy's out, the guy's out, the guy's out. Of course, if you have 10 to 50 to 75 women accusing the same man of the same pattern of sexual misconduct, well, it's probably true, right? So I think I think on the one hand that we exposed and condemned sexual harassment, rape, forced sex on the job. I write about what happened to me when I worked at the UN and was sexually harassed and raped. It was not a happy time, and I could not get feminist support, and my rapist had diplomatic immunity. It taught me very important lessons, a high price for that kind of education. So in 1975, Lynn Farley, at a hearing in New York City, talked about, coined the phrase sexual harassment, and then wrote a book, maybe by 1978. Then Kitty McKinnon wrote a book, 1979. Had this history been taught again and again and again, maybe the Me Too movement would have happened a lot sooner and would have continued in a very continuous way. So I would like it to gain legs on the ground. I'm not sure where it goes from here. I think it's a good thing. I think, by the way, because Asia Argento is now being accused herself, if she's guilty of a crime, then she should be held accountable for it. But that doesn't mean that Weinstein didn't commit major crimes as well. One can walk and chew gum at the same time. One does not cancel out the other. That's very important to remember. What do you think about the current resurgence of so-called feminist manifestos? I'm not sure I know of any current recent, well, I am not one of those in favor of the pussy hats. I think that many good women marched and had local and important issues that mattered to them. But the leaders of that march, I know too many women who are killed because their hijab, their headscarf slips, who are beaten badly and locked up, to glorify hijab wearing as an act of resistance or as an act of resistance to racism. And I didn't much appreciate seeing American flags turned into hijabs. I didn't like the whole program. I don't know if that's well, actually, what I didn't like is that lip service to abortion, but then so much concern, focus on many other legitimate issues in which women are not central. This is a problem that I've noted in how women's studies has devolved, or some would say evolved. It's no longer women's studies. It's often sexuality, gender and sexuality studies, LGBTQIA, queer, and where are the women? Where are the shelters for battered women? Where are the increase in funding for the Violence Against Women Act? Not as sexy as climate apocalypse, and many other issues. I don't want to get into it because we don't have enough time. You know the issues I'm thinking of. So if these are manifestos or a way of branding feminism, I'm not in favor of that. Another, oh, all right. Oh, would you say you wrote this book, as they say, more in sorrow or pain than in anger or resentment and regret? Thanks for a superb reading. Well, thank you, whoever you may be. A publisher approached me and charmed me into doing it. I would not have done it on my own. I have no regrets. These days, publishing can be a painful process, but writing never is, and it wasn't. Anger, not really. Oh, somebody's waving a... I mean, I needed to record and document a past that is lost, that is not documented, and that has been lost. And as they say, you know, culturally appropriated. It's been only a few feminist names are known in the world. Everyone else has been disappeared. All the good works don't exist. And if you don't write in a postmodern Lacanian style, which is completely incomprehensible even by academics, which is the point, because you're too afraid to have anyone understand what you're really saying because it might get you in trouble. So that, whatever has happened to, and I don't regret having pioneered women's studies. I think it's time to have a feminist canon, and for that matter, a social studies, the entire academy, that is grounded in real knowledge, not just in recent personal biased opinion. So if you're going to be talking about women's studies, you ought to start with Mary Wollstonecraft and John Stuart Mill, and do not pass go without studying Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony and Matilda Jocelyn Gage and Perkins Gilman, Charlotte Perkins Gilman. That's just for starters. Sojourner Truth, Harriet Brent Jacobs. Before you get to the anti-colonial, post-colonial, only 21st century writings, you have to have some basis. Most of the Ivy Leagues are not even teaching Simone de Beauvoir. I did a very fast check, and Oxford is offering it, a reading of Simone de Beauvoir, 1949. And Eleanor I mean, I can go on with a lot of names. So don't regret it, but it really needs to be restored and revived. Somebody writes, I have a ready-to-go poetry manuscript. It is, of course, hard finding a publisher. Shall I seek for an agent or self-publish? Thank you. Okay. Poetry, that queen of art, is held low in our culture. So you have to have a day job. Never give up the day job. You've got to have a way of earning a living if you really are a good poet or committed to poetry. And you seek out little venues that publish poetry. And step by step, you make your way. Eventually, who knows, you might get a real publisher. You might. You might. I don't think agents take on poets unless you're married to the agent. No, I answered that one. Oh, now we have the space until 8:30, right? 8? Oh, all right. So I can't answer the next question because we've run out of time. If we're going to have time for me to sign anybody's book, if you buy a book. Yes? What? I can't hear you. What did you say?
Don't worry, just making sure the mic works. Your talk is until 8 or 8:15, but you have the space until we close.
I see. So we're here till midnight. Are you locking us in?
We close at 10:30.
No, not. I didn't have dinner yet. So somebody said, you wrote in the New York Post that women's studies became Stalinized. Can you explain how that happened and who the key players were? Well, in the beginning, there was always a big conflict between the cultural feminists and the Marxist feminists. The Socialist Workers' Party took over this and that. The bottom line is that in the academy and in the media and in international organizations, what triumphed was the importance of race and class, more important than mere gender alone. The socialism, Marxism, Stalinism, whatever name it ran by, it was anti-West as the greatest oppressor of all times. Not as the only country that actually fought a very bloody civil war over the issue of slavery, but the worst country ever. So the Stalinization that may have failed in Soviet Russia was very alive and well among the intelligentsia in the West. It's quite amazing. Joseph Stalin lives. And by that, I also mean a penchant for totalitarian thinking. Think of what does it mean when instead of having a conversation back and forth, people shame, bully, out, protest, insult. The talking heads have become attack dogs on short leashes. What is this? This is not how education or an exchange of views, especially when you disagree. It's very important to hear something that you don't agree with, you know? So it's in that sense. It's not just women's studies, by the way. Anthropology led the way with their multicultural relativism and the belief that all cultures are the same and all behaviors are equal, except the West is worse, right? So maybe that's as far as I'll take that question, okay? And so we could come and say hello to me. Thank you, thank you.